Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler, and today is going to be a more philosophical discussion. I want to talk specifically about the sort of interlinking topics of personal responsibility and what gets referred to as the blame game. And to be clear, when I talk about personal responsibility, this is a phrase that gets thrown around to mean a lot of different things, so I wanted to make sure I define it here right at the start. What I mean by personal responsibility is the things that you personally can be responsible for about your person, and sort of the limits of that, because it's very easy to take responsibility for things that you can't actually be responsible for, and also to neglect taking responsibility for things that you are. And this interlinks with the blame game, because what happens with this, and sort of the way that I define the blame game, is blaming yourself for things that you cannot be responsible for, or blaming others for things that you are responsible for. And again, it's in this personal responsibility sense. So the sort of things I'm talking about, a really good example is sort of what the phrase, "you made me feel blank," alludes to. They did a thing, you felt a thing, they didn't make you feel that thing. You yourself felt that response to what they did. And it's very easy to sort of blame them for how you're feeling, instead of examining yourself and asking, why do I feel this way? And that's kind of in shifting personal responsibility from yourself to them, and it's giving them power over you as well, which is what I think is kind of interesting about this, is that playing the blame game is, in a way, it's pushing responsibility, because it's pushing responsibility off of yourself onto other people, or trying to take responsibility onto yourself. It's sort of playing with who has power, right? Because if you're taking responsibility from somebody else onto yourself for something, then, what's a good example of this? I have to think off the top of my head here. So let's say somebody... Actually, a good example happened to me earlier today, because I was getting the new Mario game for the Switch, Mario Odyssey, and I went to the store and gave them, it was like $65.99 after tax, and so sales tax. So I give them $70 in cash, and they hand me back $5 and a penny. Now, that's more than I should have gotten. I should have only gotten $4. So there's a couple of things that you can look at here. You can say, oh, they should have been responsible to only give me back the amount of change that I'm due. And they failed in that responsibility. On the other hand, I'm also responsible for not accepting more change than I am due. And so, like, what I did is I gave the dollar back, the extra dollar back. But this is sort of a two-part thing here, where we can look at this and say, well, I could say I'm not responsible for how much they give me back in change, and if they screw that up, that's on them. That's one way of looking at it, but that's only looking at one person's responsibility. And so it's also important to not just look at my end of the responsibility of making sure that I'm not getting more change back than I should be. And, like, you can't ignore both ends, right? Both people are responsible, but it's really easy in certain situations to sort of not have both parties accept the responsibility that they have for what happened. And that was an example that I thought was really interesting just from my life that happened earlier, about how this is, like, very multifaceted, and there's a lot of interaction and relationship between taking responsibility. So an example then of somebody taking responsibility that they shouldn't is saying, oh, a teacher, for example, or a lecturer, where somebody is just not understanding something. You have to sort of accept that you can't make them listen, you can't make them learn. And you can do what you can to provide information, you can do all that you can to try to clarify it, but if they aren't going to take the responsibility themselves to learn, there's nothing you can actually do. But it's really easy to take the blame on yourself for that person not taking in that information, not learning that thing you're trying to convey, not listening to you. But you can't do anything about it. And taking blame for what's happening with them is a huge problem, because then it's the temptation that arrives from that is to try to control the situation as much as you can, because otherwise you feel like you're failing in your responsibility when you can't actually be responsible for that. You do have to be responsible for the part that you can control, which is trying to clarify as much as you can, trying to provide information the best that you can, but it's a two-way street. You can't take responsibility if they don't tell you what's going on. Like, if they don't understand something and they don't tell you, they're just like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense, and they're not being honest with you, that's not your fault. Like, that's their responsibility. And these sort of limits then of personal responsibility can have a huge impact on sort of our societal interactions, I think, because we so often will take on too much responsibility. That is, trying to be responsible for things that only other people can be responsible for, and then get massively stressed out because we feel like we're failing at what we're supposed to do when we've done all that we can, and we actually can't do more. As an individual, you can't do more with another person if there's some sort of limit there. But on the other hand, it's also really easy to sort of ignore your own responsibilities if you're blaming other people for what's going on. Like, if you have a certain reaction to something, you can't just go around blaming the thing that happened for your reaction. Like, your reaction comes from you, not from an external source. That's a stimulus. And being responsible for managing your stimuli as much as you can, sure, but some things are going to be out of your control that way. So where can you have control? And this is something that really can impact sort of people's relationships. If they're constantly blaming everything that happens to them on other people in terms of how they're reacting, then that's fundamentally placing themselves at the mercy of others. But not only that, it's self-weakening, because you feel like everything's out of control in your life, that you're at the complete whims of the world and what others do. And that's not entirely true. You have the ability to say and sit down. Maybe you need to take time to be able to process stuff. But like, you have the ability, if you want to sit down and examine why. And maybe it's going to take a long time to figure out the why. But the why of, why do I feel this way? Why is this my response? Why, when somebody does this, do I feel offended? And how am I going to respond when I feel offended? Like, these are all things that we can control to some extent, and we can examine and understand. And this is what taking responsibility is also, is understanding why, understanding the why, taking the time to figure out the why, because that is something you can be responsible for. You can be responsible for taking that time. Now, you might not be able to be fully able to control sort of those reactions, but understanding them goes a long way to being able to sort of step outside of them and sort of observe what's happening within yourself, or at least, and this might be a personality thing as well, but being able to step outside of sort of your emotional state to be able to examine what's happening as it's happening in real time allows you to be able to sort of redirect what's happening. So there's a lot that I think happens with sort of this blame game thing. And again, just to kind of summarize, because I think I've covered what I really want to say about this one. To summarize, it's really important to understand what your limits are, and to not take responsibility beyond those limits, but to take the responsibility that's within them as well. And to be very cautious about placing blame on others for things that are within your being, but also it's really important to not take on responsibility from others that is external to your being, like that you have no ability to actually do anything with. And also, I think just as sort of a last point, there is a balance to be walked with being respectful versus responsible. And it's definitely very possible to try to be respectful of somebody else's feelings, how somebody else reacts, without being responsible for it, without feeling like you have to be doing everything you can to try to not provoke that. You can approach that from a standpoint of, I'm trying to be respectful of them, or you can approach it where you're trying to be responsible. And if you're trying to be responsible for it, they have power over you. If you're trying to be respectful, then they don't. And it's a fine line and kind of challenging to kind of find, but it's worth looking at and asking yourself when you find that you're being very sensitive around someone. And when I say sensitive, I don't necessarily just mean like cautious or whatever. Like, there's different ways that can kind of manifest, but where you're trying to be sensitive to how they feel or how they react to things, and ask, are you doing it in a way where you're being respectful, or are you trying to be responsible? And being respectful is good. Trying to be responsible beyond your own power is a recipe for all sorts of psychological torment. So that kind of concludes the things, I think. So I'd love to hear any sort of feedback, any sort of thoughts that you have on this topic, or if there's any other topics that you'd like to hear me talk about. Thank you, everyone. Take care, and bye-bye.